Imagine conquering nations, building dynasties, rewriting maps of Europe, and being remembered as the fart, or the cabbage, or the slobberer. This isn't satire. These were real rulers with real crowns and painfully real nicknames that outlived their empires. In this video, we're going through 44 of the most absurd, savage, and downright humiliating nicknames ever given to historical leaders, and the brutal, bizarre, sometimes tragic reasons they stuck for centuries. 1. Imagine having a nickname so vile that it literally stinks for over 1,000 years. Byzantine Emperor Constantine V is unfortunately immortalized as Copernimus, which politely translates to the dung-named. While later historians try to claim he was a brilliant general, the church had the ultimate smear campaign ready. The story goes that during his infant baptism, he had a violent bowel movement right into the holy water of the sacred font. The disgusted patriarch declared it a horrifying omen that the boy would destroy the church and effectively branded him with a poop joke for eternity. No matter how many battles he won, he could never wash away the stain of that one disastrous baptism. 2. Justinian II of Byzantium holds the title for the most insane comeback tour in history, with his nickname, the slit-nosed. After being overthrown, his enemies literally cut off his nose in a brutal public ceremony, believing that a disfigured man could never be emperor again because he was imperfect. Instead of retiring, Justinian had a solid gold nose, prosthetic custom-made, rallied a terrifying army of barbarians, and stormed back into Constantinople to reclaim his throne. Imagine the sheer horror of seeing a vengeful tyrant leading a charge with a glittering golden schnoz, proving that you do not need cartilage to sniff out your enemies and destroy them. 3. Eystein the fart? Sounds like a cheap insult a teenager would scribble on a bathroom wall, but it is the actual historical title of a Norwegian king. Eystein Halfdanson ruled a small kingdom in the 8th century, and somehow his entire legacy was reduced to a nickname that implies he had serious gastrointestinal issues. While other Viking kings were named after wolves, bears, or terrifying weapons, Eystein was apparently famous for passing wind at the absolute worst possible moments. It is hard to imagine his enemies trembling in fear when the herald announced the arrival of a king whose name sounded like a whoopee cushion. 4. We have all struggled with holiday weight gain, but King Sancho I of Leon took it to a catastrophic level that earned him the title Sancho the Fat. In the 10th century, he became so morbidly obese that he could no longer mount a horse, wield a sword, or even walk without assistance. His nobles actually deposed him just for being too heavy. Desperate, he went to his grandmother for help, and she put him on the most brutal diet in history. Physicians supposedly sewed his lips shut, leaving only a tiny opening for a straw to suck down a mixture of opium and herbs. He lost half his body weight and reclaimed his throne, proving that extreme dieting is not a modern invention. 5. Childeric III holds the title for the most brutal and direct nickname in the history of royalty because he is simply known as Childeric the Idiot. There is no poetry or metaphor here. His own people just looked at him and collectively decided he was not the sharpest sword in the armory. He was the last king of his dynasty and was essentially a puppet who sat in a room while other people did the actual work of ruling. History does not tell us exactly what he did to earn such a harsh label, but being officially recorded as the idiot for over 1,000 years is a level of disrespect that burns longer than any fire. 6. In the brutal Game of Thrones, you usually need noble blood to rule, which is why the nickname of Ivaylo of Bulgaria, the cabbage, is so incredibly legendary. Ivaylo was not a prince. He was a literal pig farmer who got sick of the weak Tsar letting Mongols raid his village. In a move that defies all logic, he led a peasant uprising, actually defeated the Mongol Golden Horde, killed the incompetent king, and married the queen to become Tsar himself. The terrified nobility called him lettuce or cabbage to mock his agricultural roots, but honestly, if a guy puts down his hoe and seizes the crown, calling him a vegetable just makes the nobles look even more pathetic for losing to him. 7. Archibald Douglas has the most hurtful nickname of all time, because he is forever known in Scottish history as Archibald the Loser. This poor nobleman was actually a decent guy, but he had a spectacular talent for losing almost every battle he ever fought. It was not just one bad day on the field, it was a consistent streak of military failures that would make anyone want to change their name and move to a farm. He lost battles, he got captured, and he generally had the worst luck imaginable. History can be cruel, but officially recording a guy as the loser in the history books is a level of pettiness that feels extremely personal. 8. It is genuinely hard to command absolute authority when you physically cannot control your own mouth. Alfonso IX of Leon was a chaotic ruler known as the Slobberer, and the history books are not being metaphorical. Accounts describe him as having a condition where, whenever he flew into a rage or got overly excited, he would froth at the mouth and drool uncontrollably like a rabid animal. Imagine trying to deliver a passionate speech to your knights or threaten a rival kingdom, but everyone is just awkwardly staring at the foam dripping down your royal chin. He founded a prestigious university, yet history mostly remembers that he needed a very absorbent handkerchief at all times. 9. Charles VI of France takes the prize for the most fragile ego in history because he is known as Charles the Mad. This is not just because he made bad decisions, but because he genuinely believed his royal body was made of glass. Imagine the King of France refusing to move or let anyone touch him because he was terrified he would shatter into a million pieces like a dropped vase. He went as far as sewing iron rods into his clothes to protect his delicate glass ribs from breaking if someone bumped into him. It is pretty hard to lead a terrifying cavalry charge when you are screaming at your knights to stop vibrating the floor because you might crack. 10. Everyone knows the Roman Emperor Caligula as a sadistic maniac who wanted to make his horse a senator, but his legendary name is actually an embarrassing childhood nickname that means little boots. When he was a toddler, his father dressed him up in a tiny, adorable miniature soldier's uniform, complete with little army booties, and the troops thought it was the cutest thing ever. It is absolutely hilarious that one of history's most feared and depraved monsters, who terrorized Rome and declared himself a living god, is eternally remembered by a name that sounds like a brand of baby shoes at a discount department store. 11. Frederick I of Mason is called Frederick the Bitten because of a traumatizing family soap opera. He did not get this mark fighting a dragon. He got it from his own mother, Margaret. When she discovered her husband was cheating and plotting to murder her, she decided to flee the castle in a panic. Overcome with hysterical grief at leaving her infant son behind in a nest of vipers, she grabbed Frederick to kiss him goodbye, but was so distraught that she bit deep into his cheek, leaving a permanent, jagged scar. It was a lifelong, disfiguring reminder that his father was a scumbag and his mother had really intense separation anxiety. 12. Henry IV of Castile carries the brutal title Henry the Impotent, which might be the most politically damaging nickname a monarch could receive. In a dynasty built entirely on producing heirs, rumors about his inability to secure a clear successor spiraled into full-blown civil war. His enemies weaponized gossip, claiming his daughter wasn't even his. In medieval politics, perception was everything. Once the court stopped believing in your legacy, the crown was already slipping. Henry didn't just lose authority in private. He lost it in public, and history never let him forget it. 13. Pippin the Short sounds less like a founder of a mighty dynasty and more like a friendly sidekick in a fantasy novel who brings you snacks. The father of the legendary Charlemagne was a powerhouse who expanded the Frankish kingdom, yet history remembers him like a garden gnome. It is hilarious that one of the most influential figures in European history carries a nickname that sounds like a squeaky toy for a dog. Despite the cute name, Pippin was a master politician who stole the throne from the lazy previous kings and proved that you can have a name that sounds like a distinct lack of height and still be the absolute boss of Europe. 14. Ivar the Boneless sounds less like a terrifying Viking warlord and more like a specific order of chicken wings at a sports bar. But do not be fooled by the delicious-sounding name, because this guy was a nightmare for 9th century England. Historians are still arguing about why he had this nickname, with some suggesting he had a condition that made his legs useless, so he had to be carried into battle on a shield. Others think he was just incredibly flexible, or maybe he just had no bones to pick with anyone until they made him angry. Regardless of his skeletal situation, leading a great heathen army while possibly being unable to walk is a serious flex. 15. Louis V of France carries the distinct dishonor of being remembered as Louis the Sluggard or Louis the Do-Nothing. Imagine your only contribution to history being that you were incredibly lazy and achieved absolutely zero significant things during your reign. He ruled for only 1 year and spent most of it annoying his powerful neighbors and failing to resolve any conflicts before dying in a hunting accident. Historians looked at his short career and realized there was literally nothing to write about, so they just labeled him a slacker for eternity. It is like showing up to work, taking a nap at your desk, and then getting a golden plaque commemorating your ability to waste time. 16. Selim the Sod is a nickname that tells you exactly what this Ottoman Sultan's priorities were, and they definitely were not ruling the empire. While his father Suleiman the Magnificent was busy conquering the world and building mosques, Selim was busy conquering every bottle of wine in Istanbul. He is the first sultan who openly decided that running a massive empire was boring compared to partying in the palace. Legend even says he invaded Cyprus specifically because he really liked their vintage wine and wanted a direct supply. You know you have a problem when you start declaring international wars just to refill your liquor cabinet. 17. Charles the Bald is the ultimate example of medieval sarcasm, because coins and paintings from his time show him with a full head of hair. It turns out the nickname was likely an ironic joke by his court or a jab at the fact that he did not have his own kingdom for a long time, unlike his brothers. Imagine being a powerful king in the 9th century and everyone calls you Baldy behind your back, even though you have a luscious mane of hair flowing in the wind. It is like calling a 7-foot-tall giant tiny, except this joke ended up in every history textbook for 1,000 years. 18. Joanna of Castile earned the name Joanna the Mad after her intense devotion to her husband, Philip the Handsome, turned into something history would label as instability. After his sudden death, she refused to accept the loss, traveling with his coffin across Spain and insisting he remain treated as king. Whether this was grief, political manipulation by rivals, or genuine mental collapse is still debated. But in royal courts, anything that looked like emotional excess became ammunition. Her sorrow became her sentence, and the nickname outlived her story. 19. Harold Bluetooth might sound like he was a time traveler who invented wireless headphones, but his nickname was strictly dental. This Viking king of Denmark and Norway had a dead tooth that looked dark blue or black, which was probably very distracting during serious negotiations. He is famous for uniting Scandinavia just like the technology unites our devices today, which is actually why the tech companies named it after him. It is wild to think that every time you connect your phone to your car, you are technically paying tribute to a Viking warlord with terrible oral hygiene and a smile that could stop a battle. 20. Louis the Universal Spider is the creepiest nickname on this list and sounds like a villain from a low-budget horror movie. King Louis XI of France earned this title because he loved spinning webs of conspiracy and traps for his enemies rather than fighting them directly. He was paranoid, wore cheap, shabby clothes to trick people, and spent his days sitting in his castle plotting the downfall of his rivals like a master puppeteer. Instead of being a shining knight in armor, he was the guy in the shadows taking notes and ruining your life with a single whispered rumor. 21. Vsevolod. The Big Nest has a nickname that makes him sound like a giant bird guarding a pile of eggs rather than a fearsome Grand Prince of Kiev. This Russian ruler got this weirdly cozy label simply because he had a ridiculous amount of children. We are talking about 12 kids, which is basically a small army or a full sports team running around the palace. In the Middle Ages, having that many heirs was a strategy to ensure your family survived, but it also meant his legacy is essentially being a really stressed-out dad with no privacy. It is hard to be intimidated by a warlord when his defining trait is just needing a really massive house for his toddlers. 22. Ethelred the Unready has the kind of nickname that makes him sound like he was constantly showing up late to his own meetings without his pants. It is actually a bit of a translation error from Old English where his name meant noble counsel, but his nickname meant no counsel, making it a very clever medieval pun that nobody understands anymore. However, the label stuck because he was genuinely terrible at handling Viking invasions and usually tried to pay them to go away instead of fighting. History basically remembers him as the guy who was buffering at 99% while the Danes were burning down his house. 23. John Lackland sounds like the school bully making fun of the poor kid who did not get any lunch money. King John is famous for being the bad guy in Robin Hood stories, but his real-life nickname came from his own father, King Henry II. Since John was the youngest son, all the good land was already given to his older brothers, leaving him with absolutely nothing. He eventually became king, and then immediately lost most of his French territories, so he really lived up to the name by lacking land twice in his life. It is pretty harsh when your defining historical trait is owning zero real estate. 24. Garcia. The Trembling of Navarre has a nickname that makes him sound like a chihuahua facing a vacuum cleaner. You would assume he was a coward who hid under his bed, but the story is actually the opposite. He was a brave warrior who would physically shake from adrenaline and nerves before every single battle. When his squires told him he was trembling with fear, he famously replied that his body was just afraid of where his spirit was about to take it. It is a great comeback, but history still labeled him with a name that makes him sound like he needed a warm blanket and a cup of tea. 25. Before he became the legendary William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England had to deal with the absolute worst branding crisis in medieval Europe because everyone called him William the Bastard. It was not just a mean nickname whispered in back alleys. It was his official title in documents because his parents were not married. Imagine trying to command respect from terrifying knights and fierce barons when your own name sounds like an insult a teenager would yell on Xbox Live. He hated it so much that he invaded England and took over the entire country just so he could finally force people to update his contact info to something that sounded like a winner. 26. Edward I of England terrified half of Scotland and Wales, but his nickname Longshanks sounds like a character from a children's book who eats too much soup. In the Middle Ages, people were generally much shorter, so Edward stood out like a sore thumb because he was a towering giant with incredibly long legs and arms. His limbs were so lanky that he could probably step over a small castle wall without even jumping. While his enemies were trembling in fear of his military tactics, his own soldiers were basically calling him Daddy Long Legs behind his back. It is hard to be the hammer of the Scots when you look like you were stretched on a rack for fun. 27. Louis II of France has the kind of nickname that makes you feel bad for laughing because he is eternally known as Louis the Stammerer. Public speaking is already a nightmare for most people, but imagine being the king of a major European power and physically struggling to give a simple order to your troops. While other kings were roaring inspirational speeches that made soldiers want to run through brick walls, Louis was likely stuck on the first syllable of the first word. It creates this incredibly awkward image of thousands of knights standing in total silence on a battlefield, just patiently waiting for their monarch to finish a sentence so they can finally go fight. 28. Boleslaw IV of Poland carries the nickname Boleslaw the Curly, which makes him sound less like a rugged medieval duke and more like a pampered poodle winning a dog show. In an era defined by iron armor, blood, and dirt, this guy's defining historical feature was his fantastic hair routine. You have to wonder if he spent more time strategizing for war or worrying about how the humidity in the dungeon would ruin his natural volume. It is practically impossible to look menacing and gritty when your legacy is tied to having bouncy, well-conditioned ringlets that made all the ladies in the court jealous of your shampoo game. 29. Harold I of England was a Viking king with a nickname that sounds like he belonged in a cartoon race, Harold Harefoot. He earned this speedy title not because he had big fuzzy feet, but because he was unbelievably fast and could run down a horse on foot. Most kings preferred to ride majestically into town on a stallion to look down on the peasants. But Harold was apparently obsessed with cardio and loved sprinting everywhere. It is a hilarious mental image to picture the ruler of the nation just zooming past his exhausted bodyguards like a medieval version of the Flash, leaving everyone in the dust wondering where the king went. 30. Piero di Cosimo de' Medici was the ruler of Florence during the artistic explosion of the Renaissance, yet he is remembered by the incredibly uncool nickname Piero the Goody. Gout is a painful disease caused by eating too much rich food and drinking too much wine, so his nickname is basically announcing to the world that he partied way too hard. Because his feet hurt so badly, he often had to rule the most powerful city in Italy while lying in his bedroom. Imagine trying to negotiate complex treaties and bank loans while wearing your pajamas and complaining about your big toe. It is the ultimate work-from-home setup before the internet even existed. 31. Ragnar Lodbrok is arguably the most famous Viking superstar of all time, but his legendary name literally translates to Ragnar Hairy Breeches or Ragnar Shaggy Pants. It sounds ridiculous today, but the story claims he wore fuzzy pants made of animal fur specifically to protect his legs from snake bites while trying to win a bet to marry a princess. So the most feared raider in Europe who sacked Paris and terrorized England is basically named after his questionable fashion choice of wearing furry sweatpants into combat. It proves that you can wear absolutely anything you want as long as you swing an axe hard enough to silence the fashion police. 32. Wilfred the Hairy sounds like a circus attraction, but he was actually the serious Count of Barcelona and the founder of Catalonia. While most nobles were obsessed with grooming, Wilfred apparently had hair growing in places where hair should absolutely not be growing. Medieval chroniclers made a huge deal about him being covered in fur like a human rug, implying that he did not need armor because he had a natural sweater protecting him from the cold. He spent his life fighting brave battles against the Moors, but history just cannot get past the fact that the guy probably clogged every drain in the castle. 33. Lulach the Fool has to be one of the most heartbreaking nicknames in Scottish history because the poor guy never stood a chance. He was the stepson of the real King Macbeth and only ruled for a few pitiful months before being assassinated. The history books dubbed him the Simple or the Fool. Not because he was a comedian, but because the nobles thought he was totally incompetent and barely knew which end of the sword to hold. Imagine becoming King of Scotland only for everyone to immediately roll their eyes and agree that you are just a placeholder until a real leader shows up. 34. Swine Forkbeard sounds like a pirate captain from a cartoon, but he was a brutally effective Viking king of Denmark who actually conquered England. His nickname came from his very specific facial hairstyle, where his long beard was split right down the middle into two distinct prongs. In an era where a big bushy beard was a sign of masculinity, Sweyn decided to style his face like a piece of silverware. It is pretty wild that he managed to overthrow the English government and drive the king into exile while looking like he spent hours in front of a mirror perfecting his split ends with beard oil. 35. Folk the Surly or Folk the Sour is the perfect nickname for that one guy at the party who just refuses to have a good time. Folk II of Anjou was known for his constantly grumpy attitude and generally unpleasant vibe that made everyone around him miserable. While other counts were trying to be known as the Brave or the Great, Folk was apparently just walking around with a scowl on his face, complaining about the weather and the food. It is impressive to be so consistently negative that history remembers your personality as simply being a lemon. 36. Boleslaw the Wry-mouthed sounds like a villain from a twisted fairy tale, but he was actually a very capable Duke of Poland. His nickname came from a physical deformity that made his mouth twist to one side, giving him a permanent look of skepticism or disgust. It must have been incredibly awkward for his advisors to deliver bad news, because Boleslaw always looked like he was silently judging their incompetence, even if he was actually happy. Leading a country is stressful enough without having a face that constantly looks like you just smelled something terrible in the throne room. 37. Robert Curta-hose sounds like a high school bully, making fun of a kid's fashion choices, but it was actually the nickname of the eldest son of William the Conqueror. The name literally translates to short stockings or short boots, because Robert had stubby little legs and wore pants that were way too short for him. The worst part is that his own father, the King of England, started the nickname to mock his son's lack of height and poor tailoring. It is pretty hard to command the respect of Norman knights when your dad is constantly shouting, "Hey, shorty pants," across the castle courtyard in front of your entire army. 38. Ludwig the Springer sounds like an Olympic athlete, and his story is honestly worthy of an action movie. This medieval count earned his bouncy nickname because he famously escaped a high-security prison tower by leaping from the battlements into the river Saal below. Legend says he wore a bright white cloak so his rescuers could see him, or maybe to look stylish while plummeting through the air. While most nobles died in their beds or in battle, Ludwig is the only one remembered for inventing medieval parkour to get out of trouble, proving that sometimes the best political strategy is just to jump. 39. Halfdan the Mild sounds less like a vicious Viking warlord and more like a flavor of salsa that you buy for a toddler's birthday party. In the rough world of Norse raiders, being called mild was actually a backhanded compliment about his strange management style. The sagas say he was incredibly generous with gold, paying his warriors a fortune, but he was shockingly stingy with food and starved them at dinner time. So his legacy is being the boss who gives you a huge Christmas bonus check but refuses to provide free coffee in the break room. It is a weird mix of being a legendary king and a cheapskate caterer. 40. William the Silent sounds like a mime or a librarian, but he was actually the charismatic leader of the Dutch Revolt who wouldn't shut up about freedom. His nickname is a total lie because he wasn't mute. He was just really good at keeping a secret when it mattered most. During a hunting trip, the King of France accidentally revealed a secret plot to kill all the Protestants, and William managed to keep a total poker face and say absolutely nothing instead of screaming in panic. His ability to just shut his mouth and not tweet his thoughts saved an entire nation, proving that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is just awkwardly stare at people until they leave. 41. Pippin, the eldest son of Charlemagne, is remembered as Pippin the Hunchback, a title that reduced a complex political figure to a single physical trait. Despite being the firstborn, his physical condition made powerful nobles question his suitability to rule. In a world obsessed with strength and divine symbolism, appearance carried dangerous weight. Passed over in favor of his younger brothers, Pippin eventually rebelled against his father, a move that failed and ended his ambitions. History didn't record him for his ideas or his courage, only for the curve in his back. Medieval branding could be ruthless. 42. Ptolemy XII is the father of the famous Cleopatra, but his own legacy is a complete disaster because history remembers him as the flute player. In a dynasty of god kings who built pyramids and commanded massive armies, this guy was basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a band geek who refuses to get a real job. He was so obsessed with playing the flute and partying in Dionysian festivals that he completely neglected running the country. He spent the entire treasury on bribes to Rome just so they would let him keep his throne and continue his musical hobby. It is genuinely embarrassing when your official royal title sounds less like a powerful pharaoh and more like a guy busking for loose change in a subway station. 43. Henry I of Germany founded a mighty royal dynasty, yet he is stuck forever with the nickname Henry the Fowler because of a bird-watching obsession. Legend says that when the messengers arrived to tell him he had been elected the new king, they found him knee-deep in mud, fixing his bird-catching nets and totally ignoring prestigious royal duties. While other kings were sharpening their swords or counting their gold, Henry was apparently more concerned with trapping a few pigeons for dinner. It is a hilarious image to think of the most powerful man in Germany telling the royal delegation to be quiet and wait in the bushes, because they might scare away a rare duck he was trying to catch. 44. Alfonso X of Castile was a brilliant scholar who wrote books on law and science, but his people called him the astrologer because he had his head completely in the clouds. He was so obsessed with staring at the stars and studying planetary movements that he barely noticed his own son plotting a rebellion to steal his kingdom right from under his nose. He famously stated that if he had been with God during the creation of the world, he could have given the Almighty some useful hints for a better design. That is a level of intellectual arrogance that is honestly impressive, effectively mansplaining the universe to God while losing your actual throne on Earth because you forgot to look down. 44 rulers, dozens of crowns, and somehow history chose to remember them for drooling, bad haircuts, broken noses, or catastrophic reputations. Power fades, armies disappear, but a ridiculous nickname? That survives 1,000 years. Now here's the real question. Which outrageous historical nickname did we miss that absolutely deserved to be on this list? And who do you think earned it the hardest? Drop it below. And if you enjoy watching legends get humbled by history itself, hit like and subscribe, because this channel remembers everything.